Dear Boomers, I heard your retirement funds have taken a bit of a hit. I would like to offer some advice. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Hard work pays off. Stop buying so much avocado toast and fancy lattes. Get an entry-level job to get your foot in the door. Walk into some stores and hand them your resume. Live within your means. Cut out the fancy stuff. Save every penny, put it into a savings account, and watch it grow. Quit wasting money on all those subscription services. Just walk into your boss's office and ask for a raise. Pack a lunch. You don't need to eat out. Put $20 in a jar. You'll be surprised how fast it adds up. Hope this helps. Boomers are an incredibly selfish and narcissistic generation. We all know this. They clearly don't care about anyone besides themselves, so if even they're complaining now, it's undeniable that things are bad. And we're starting to see the sentiment start to gradually trickle in that everyone is finally starting to see that Gen Z and millennials were right all along about how BS this economy and this whole system has been. As a millennial who grew up with boomer parents, I gotta say that boomers have absolutely zero right to lecture us about our spending. Boomers were the absolute most reckless generation ever when it came to managing their own spending, which comes as no surprise given how they grew up in the booming post-war economy of the 60s and are totally out of touch with modern economic conditions, until it starts affecting them, of course. Growing up, I watched my boomer parents and all the other boomer parents in the neighborhood waste so much money on all kinds of pointless shit. Every family had 2 or 3 cars, even though you can only drive one at a time, a big house with an insane mortgage that they couldn't realistically pay back without a massive loan. All these stupid antique furnitures that cost thousands of dollars for a stupid chair or closet that does the exact same thing as a budget closet or chair from IKEA does. When I look back on all their stupid spending habits, over 90% of their purchases were on totally unnecessary bullshit. It was all just a materialistic consumerism addiction to feed their fragile egos. Most of the time, when they bought a new car or whatever new shiny fancy object, it wasn't even because they needed it. It was because a neighbor or one of their friends just got a new car or some shiny new object, and as such, they felt the pressure to do so as well, purely out of stupid high school ego. Now, this sounds like it's just stupid, silly high school fun and games, and for a long time, it was, until one day when it wasn't anymore. Since boomers had such big egos and such horrible spending habits, they all had to take out massive loans to mortgage a house they knew they couldn't afford and didn't even need, just for the sake of satisfying their narcissist, consumerist egos. You know that quote from Fight Club? We spend money we don't have to buy stuff we don't need, to impress people we don't even like. That sums up boomer financial habits in a nutshell. And again, it's all fun and games until it leads to a global economic crash that ruins everything for future generations. Some of you watching may be too young to remember, but the 2008 financial crash was the single cataclysmic event that forever destroyed the American dream, and to be honest, the world never really quite recovered from that, ever. The primary cause behind that crash was a massive bubble in the housing market, caused by people, which by people, it means boomers, because boomers were the primary house buyers at the time. Boomers taking on mortgages they couldn't afford, hoping to profit from the rising house prices. It's really rich, no pun intended, that the generation whose reckless spending habits literally spurred the worst economic crash since the Great Depression has the sheer hubris to lecture us about, avocado toast, subscriptions, Netflix. Hey guys, real quick, you may have noticed we're getting very close to 10,000 subscribers now. So if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us get closer to this magic number. Would really appreciate it. Thanks a bunch. You guys are awesome. The worst thing about their narcissistic egos and their horrible, reckless spending habits was that they themselves were mostly shielded from the consequences of it. By the time they ruined the economy, it was us younger generations who ended up paying for their sins. We couldn't find jobs and got saddled with impossible student loan debts, all while listening them lecture us for not being able to make it in this economy that they themselves ruined before we were even born. But at last, it appears even they can't outrun the consequences of their actions forever. I want to be clear about one thing. It is not good to wish ill on others. People's retirement savings getting destroyed isn't something to celebrate or be happy about. It's more like how when a child does something stupid, sometimes you just have to let them do it and learn from the consequences. But it's even worse than that in this case. In this case, it's more like if you told a child that the stove was hot, but instead of touching it themselves and learning the hard way, they force someone else to do it, then called that person soft/lazy because they didn't enjoy getting burned. And in this sort of a situation, it's just really hard to have any sort of sympathy for them. And pretty much everybody in the comments agrees. It's less rough when you remember they made the impactful decisions that put everyone, including themselves, in this position. This is not to say every boomer ruined the economy and is selfish, but enough of them are. If they didn't have the power to make the decisions, they talked and they thought about it. Word spreads, and that has influence. Just like being the one who is making the decisions. Yes, boomers are not the only ones making the decisions, but by a long shot, they are the majority. Yeah, I feel no pity for the people that have been lecturing that anyone can buy a house and have a well-paying job if they work hard enough while holding 2 or 3 properties, leaving us with a housing market crisis, having shipped all the well-paying jobs abroad after they retired because it increased their pension's value. For every dollar it's costing the boomers, it's going to cost you the same. Only they have it to lose. What are you going to do? Yeah, but they're new poor. We're old poor. We know how to survive with almost nothing. Also, you can't lose money in the stock market when you can't afford to invest in it to begin with. I want to leave you guys with this last comment as it touches on a very important point and even a potential solution. Our generations have seen just how fragile and unreliable the financial system is. I mean, the whole thing is a scam. We all know this. No matter how hard you work, your money just gets wiped away by inflation or yet another recession. In my experience, the new meta is simply living a minimalist lifestyle and decreasing your dependency on money as much as possible. I recently began to learn to make my own tofu, and it's pretty crazy as with just about $2 worth of soybeans, you can make enough tofu to give you essentially an entire week's worth of protein. This has honestly given me more financial peace of mind than any job, investment, or even this YouTube channel has. Because you see, you can work hard and save money for years, only to see the value of your hard-earned money cut in half because of inflation. You can spend all this time researching and trying to pick the best investments. And you might get lucky, but even if you do, you can do all that only to see the government vanquish it with a simple snap of a finger. But nobody can take away your ability to live a happy, minimalist lifestyle. Hey guys, thank you all so much for clicking on this compilation video. I'm going to quickly open up a bit here. I recently hit a point of extreme physical and mental burnout, and yeah, I kind of just needed to take a quick bit of a break. But I am feeling fully rested and rejuvenated now, and yeah, we got a series of absolute banger videos lined up for you all this week, starting from Wednesday, so definitely be on the lookout for those. In the meantime, enjoy this epic compilation of all the videos we've made exposing how boomers are the real lazy, parasitic generation, and everything they call Gen Z is literally just a projection of themselves. Also, we've gained a lot of ground on the most vile Gen Z hater, the Angry Guy, since we set out on our mission to surpass him in subscribers at the beginning of summer. So thank you all so much for that. We still have quite a ways to go though, and there's only a few weeks of summer left, so if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us take down the biggest Gen Z hater on the internet. Wow, everyone finally gets it now, and I do mean everyone. Older generations say we all struggled in our 20s. No, you didn't. You didn't pay $2,200 for rent and $7 for eggs. You didn't graduate into $50,000 of debt and 0 job security. Gen Z isn't dramatic. They're drowning. This post got over 10,000 upvotes. Not views, upvotes. Boomers, I fed a family of 4 on $50 per week. Gen Z, $50 barely covers lunch. This isn't inflation. This is engineered poverty. This one got over 5,500 upvotes. But to be fair, these posts were found on the Gen Z subreddit, which is of course probably going to be biased. But then I came across this video of Tucker Carlson, of all people. not exactly a young woke liberal who's just been indoctrinated by Marxists or whatever they like to insult Gen Z with these days. Here's what he had to say about the baby boomers.
They remembered when Kennedy was shot. It was the day the music died. Everything they said was like the Don McLean tune. It didn't make sense. It was just a series of evocative cliches strung together to create a feeling. They were idiots, but above all, they were about themselves. I hated them then. I hate them now. In 4th grade, I remember saying to a buddy of mine, I hate these people. Our math teacher just told us, I was at Woodstock. I was like, how many fucking people were at Woodstock? Like, everyone in America was at Woodstock? I thought it was 300,000 people. They made it sound like it was... They're the worst. They're the ones who lecture us about the civil rights movement for 40 years as the actual supposed beneficiaries of the civil rights movement. Black people declined. They didn't care. They were only about feeling good about themselves. The only good thing they produced was like the music of 1972. Other than that, horrible people. Horrible. Sorry.
Finally, literally everybody gets it. Even in this polarizing time where we are more politically divided than ever, both the right and the left have found one piece of common ground that we can all agree on. Generally speaking, boomers are an absolutely horrible, disgusting, repulsive generation. It doesn't mean every one of them is a bad person individually. I mean, we've all met the occasional boomer who was a decent person individually speaking, sure. But let's be very clear. They are the exception and not the rule. But why exactly are they like this? I mean, it's important to note that to some degree, everyone is just going to be a product of their environment. Gen Z realized from an early age how bullshit the system is because, well, that's pretty much all they've known and experienced their whole lives. My generation, the millennials, were hopelessly and delusionally optimistic about the future because we still remember the good times of the 90s and the early 2000s. So we all know boomers are the absolute worst, most selfish and narcissistic generation ever. But why exactly are they like this? What were the historical factors they grew up with that made them that way? A great Gen Z YouTuber a lot of you probably know by the name of What If Altist made a great historical breakdown video about this. It's titled How the Baby Boomers Ruined Society. It's gotten over 1.5 million views and, to be honest, could use 10 million more. He made a lot of fantastic and interesting points on how the historical context boomers grew up in made them the absolute monsters that they are today. Perhaps the most important defining historical event that made boomers the way they are now is World War II, the absolute worst conflict in human history. Now, boomers themselves never experienced the war as they were the first generation to be born after its conclusion. But the butterfly effect, the after effects of the World War, rippled throughout society for decades and set the stage for the inception of the worst generation ever. The world was in total collapse and ruin after the conclusion of World War II. The scars of its devastation were seen and felt literally everywhere. It was almost as if the entire world had been completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt again from ground zero. Enter the first generation to be born into these circumstances. Essentially, all of civilization was being rebuilt after the war. And so baby boomers who were born into this historical context grew up under the illusion that the world began with them. This explains why they're just so selfish, arrogant, out of touch, and narcissistic. To some level, people are just a product of their environment. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does somewhat explain it. What If Altist did a fantastic job connecting the dots here. It's very easy to see why someone who grows up in a time where it feels like the world began with you would end up becoming extremely self-centered and narcissistic. This, by the way, is not just speculation either. There's a lot of hard data and evidence that there are way more sociopaths and narcissists per capita in the boomer generation than any other one. Bruce Cannon Gibney exposes this more in depth in his book titled A Generation of Sociopaths: How the Baby Boomers Betrayed America. Now, people love to throw out the whole Gen Z doesn't even know what gender they are as a cheap shot insult towards Gen Z, but boomers literally don't even know what year it is. They're stuck in some weird psychological time freeze where they think it's still 1960 and rent is still $50 per month. They're the true brain rot generation. Their brain rot is so severe that they literally don't know how to perform basic math functions. I'm not talking about advanced or even intermediate mathematics like algebra or geometry. I'm talking about how they don't even know how to perform basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. When you mention how unbelievably expensive everything has gotten today, boomers will gaslight you by saying wages were lower back in their day too, therefore it evens out. But this is just totally delusional brain rot logic. You have to actually break down how wages compare to overall living expenses back then to get the whole picture. Also, wages only matter if you even have income in the first place, which a third of Gen Z doesn't even have because the boomers turned the economy into such dog shit for future generations, which renders the entire argument about wages being higher totally useless for a third of Gen Z anyways. And as for the remainder of Gen Z that actually does have some semblance of an income, well, this guy right here explains it perfectly.
If you look back to 1980, the rent was $243. Minimum wage was $3.10, meaning your monthly gross was $496. So to rent this apartment, it would be 48.9% of your gross income back in 1980. But let's fast forward to 2024. The average rent is $17.47. The federal minimum wage is $7.25, giving you $11.60. You can't even get an apartment with the federal minimum wage, but let's be generous and double the federal minimum wage because people at Walmart and fast food joints are making $14.50 to $15. So $14.50 would bring you to $23.20, and it'd be 75% of your gross income, making double the federal minimum wage in 2024. But let's take it even a step further. ZipRecruiter said that starting pay for college graduates is $24 an hour. So that would be $38.40 a month. Someone with a bachelor's degree could afford this one-bedroom apartment, but it would be 45.4% of their gross income. A college graduate is spending the same amount of their income on rent as the minimum wage worker in 1980 did.
And on top of all that, one additional factor that he probably just didn't have time to cover in the context of a YouTube short is that even most college graduates can't get jobs anymore. Or even if they do, it's not a job that required a degree in the first place. And they're being saddled with insane amounts of student loan debt, which is cutting into their monthly budget even more. This boomer brain rot logic of, but wages were lower back then too, without factoring how much lower they were relative to living costs, is like everything else, just pure dumb boomer delusion. Hey guys, so I'm on a mission and I need your help. You see, I've made it the purpose of this channel to defend Gen Z from all these nasty delusional Gen Z haters, and I've just realized we're starting to get close to taking down the most despicable one yet, the angry guy. This guy is not just another delusional old fart calling Gen Z lazy. He's literally had videos where he openly celebrates Gen Z suffering and even dying. He's just straight up a terrible, terrible human being. Now, thankfully, his channel is rapidly dying and we are rapidly gaining ground on him as we speak. So, if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us take down the biggest Gen Z hater out there. The current goal is to surpass him in subscribers by the end of summer. With your help, we can absolutely do this. And Bruce Cannon Gibney's book further exposes this fact regarding the issue of college, specifically college tuition. Boomers are expert gaslighters. We all know and have experienced this over and over by now. One reason they're overwhelmingly against student loan forgiveness is because they'll often tell you, and I'm sure you've heard this by now, college was always expensive, even back in my day. Again, just another delusional boomer brain rot take. If you actually look at the actual hard data and evidence, you'll see that per usual, it pretty much says the exact opposite. According to official sources, in the mid-1960s, college tuition was only $243 annually, not per semester, per year. But wages were lower back then too. Okay, so let's adjust this for inflation. $243 from 1965 is equivalent to $2,492 and some change in today's money. Now, anyone who's gone to college recently will know that that's exponentially cheaper than tuition prices today, even after adjusting for inflation. The average college tuition today is anywhere between 5 to 10 times that amount, depending on in-state versus out-of-state, and this is the reason we can't take any of their opinion seriously, and why it feels so impossible to have any real conversation with them. In order to have a productive conversation with a grown adult about real-world issues, there has to be a baseline common sense level of basic real world concepts such as how math and numbers work. I don't have the time or energy to engage in a long form conversation with you if I have to explain to you that 1 + 1 = 2, or that inflation does actually exist and is a very real economic factor. And when you tell me that wages were lower back then too, without factoring exactly how much lower they were relative to living costs and inflation, you're basically telling me you don't understand the basic math concept that 50 divided by 2 is still way less than 2,000 divided by 10, 12, 15, or even 20. And yeah, sorry, but I don't have the time to explain to you how basic multiplication and division works if you somehow never learned that in grade school. And the absolute scariest part is that these brain rot old farts who don't know how to do basic multiplication and division are for the most part in charge of running the country and making all the decisions impacting our futures right now as we speak. Is it any wonder why this country has gone to such shit since they took over and started running things? Let's wrap up this video by exposing the sheer brain rot of one of my favorite boomers we've covered before right here on this channel, Dr. Phil. By the way, we have to use the term doctor in very, very loose terms here. A funny story we'll probably get into another one of these days. Now, Dr. Phil recently made a video where he covered the crippling cost of living crisis in America right now, and he actually seemed like he was finally coming around here. I mean, he was fairly sympathetic to his guests who were telling him their heartbreaking stories of just how much pain, economic pain, inflation had inflicted on them and their families in the modern day and age. And as I was watching this, at first I thought, maybe he's starting to slowly step out of his boomer brain rot finally. And then he made this video, why so many adults live at home. Gee, I wonder why. I mean, is this literally a rhetorical question at this point? And when I watched that video, it was literally the biggest contradiction ever to the previous video I mentioned. On one hand, he's acknowledging that inflation does in fact exist. And by the way, how pathetic is this? I mean, how low has the bar gotten that we actually credit boomers for understanding the basic economic concept of inflation at this point? Anyways, but in the next video, he's totally dismissing inflation as some sort of non-existent fairy tale concept that, I don't know, he thinks Gen Z is just using it as an excuse to not move out, apparently. As if inflation magically decides to affect everyone else besides Gen Z, right? In the video, he actually does acknowledge that rent prices have gone up significantly. But, ladies and gentlemen, you gotta listen to this. He presents a very genius solution. Just get a roommate.
Phil, so they're not making enough to live on their own. Well, get a roommate.
This is what I mean by boomer brain rot is such insanity that it's a waste of time even bothering to have a conversation with them. I'm at a point where I'd have to explain to Dr. Phil the basic math concept that a really, really big number divided by 2 is still a really big number. Even if you were to divide the average rent in half, it's still around $1,000 per month, which is significantly more than even I was paying as a millennial 10 years ago. And it's still over twice as much as baby boomers were paying for rent. And yes, even after accounting for wage differences. So yeah, as you can see, boomers are the true brain rot generation here. Math, history, facts, and hard evidence all prove it, and don't let them gaslight you into thinking anything otherwise. On top of being a totally delusional brain rot generation, they're also by far and away the biggest lazy parasitic generation ever. They'll shame you for being lazy and not working, but they themselves do nothing but sit around on their own butts collecting welfare in their own form of social security, which, by the way, is far and away the biggest financial burden to society right now. We expose this more in this video right here. Check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching. America is in deep, deep debt, and young people are paying for it. The US added a whopping $1.6 trillion in debt last year. When you hear about the debt and deficit, these numbers have gotten so cartoonish that it's easy to just tune them out at this point. But to put into perspective just how insane this is, the US total debt throughout all of history didn't hit 1 trillion until 1981. It took over 200 years from George Washington to Ronald Reagan to accumulate America's first $1 trillion of debt. And this was a huge deal and a massive headline at the time when it happened. And now we add nearly double that every single year. It's clear the system is broken. It's a BS rigged game with no winners. Gen Z has realized this and rightfully deciding they don't want to work and pay into this crap. And as a result, they've been relentlessly criticized for being lazy and a burden to the economy. But wait, who's really the biggest burden to the economy here? Well, if you look at the facts and numbers, it's not Gen Z. It's actually the very people criticizing Gen Z. If you're a Gen Z or millennial watching this, you are already being pushed to the absolute limit. Living costs have totally skyrocketed out of control, and most of us are living paycheck to paycheck. Then when you finally do receive your already way too small paycheck, you realize it got even further reduced due to taxes. This is an incredibly frustrating situation that many of us live in today. So it's worth it to see where the hell are your taxes even going? Where is the biggest tax burden here? Let's take a look at some of the biggest culprits people understandably feel frustrated by. Number 1, foreign aid. Now, it can certainly be frustrating to know that despite its own citizens struggling, the government would rather take care of other countries than you who actually lives here. But how much does the government actually give? The answer is 66 billion. It's not nothing, but compared in context to the total deficit of 1.6 trillion, it's not much. What about food stamps? I mean, it really sucks knowing that you work yourself to death every day only to know that someone else eats for free, right? Well, the total amount the US spent on food stamp assistance last year was 115 billion. Again, it's not nothing, but compared in context to the entire $1.6 trillion deficit, not that much in the grand scheme of things. So, what's actually the biggest burden that's costing so much money here? Well, now we arrive at our usual culprit in pretty much every single video. Boomers. Social Security is welfare for boomers. It's essentially a universal basic income for boomers. So based on how much everything else costs, how much of your tax dollars do you think are being given out to boomer welfare? 200 billion? Guess again. 500 billion? Still not even close. 1 trillion? Closer, but still not quite. The answer is a staggering 1.4 trillion, essentially enough to match the national deficit alone. We would actually have close to a full-on balanced national budget if we weren't paying so much money into boomer welfare.
Social Security is run like a Ponzi scheme. And every time I say that, I get told, you're going to make old people mad. I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. I'm trying to just explain what's actually going on. The money you put into Social Security today doesn't go in an account for you when you retire. The money you put into Social Security today goes to somebody else that is collecting on Social Security. If you did that in the private sector, you would be arrested for setting up a Ponzi scheme. But when the federal government does it, it's okay because they have the legal right to do crap like this. Okay, well,
before we go on, let's take a moment to debunk what I'm sure is going to be a common rebuttal point. But they paid into it, so they deserve to take out of it right now. People tend to have a very simple-minded, binary 0 and 1 approach when it comes to economics. Either you work or you don't. Either you paid into it or you didn't. Either you deserve it or don't. But the truth is a lot more complicated than that. The Social Security Fund was established in 1935, at a time when the average life expectancy was just 60 years old, and there weren't nearly as many elderly people. Boomers are living much longer than that, have horrible spending habits, and as a result, are a way bigger burden to Social Security than what it was originally meant to cover. What they paid into it, whatever it was, they already drained out of it a long, long time ago. At this point, whatever they paid into it is totally gone. This is why even though we're paying into it, the Social Security Fund is running out so rapidly that none of us are going to see it when we're retirement age. As the guy said earlier, it is us young people that are taking the full brunt of subsidizing the record national deficit worth of taxes just to support boomer welfare at this point, all while they tell us we're the lazy ones and need to just work harder. Part 1, a historical perspective. You should be grateful. In the past, people had to deal with plagues and wars. You should be grateful for the dog shit wages we pay you, because in the past, people didn't even have electricity or running water. Boomers love to use these BS historical arguments to gaslight us. I'm sure you've heard this horse shit from your asshole boomer parents more times than you can count. So if that's the case, using their own logic right back at them is complete fair game. If they want us to be grateful because of the context of human history, we should hold them to the exact same standards. So let's talk about how the elderly were treated before Social Security existed. Social Security was invented less than 100 years ago. This is a tiny speck of dust in the context of 10,000 years of human history. So let's talk about how the elderly were treated before the conception of Social Security. Before Social Security existed, concepts of retirement were a pipe dream for most old people. Most of them literally had to work until their death. If you didn't save up enough money during your prime working years, it was tough luck. You then had to hope you could find a part-time, less demanding job that would support you enough and really cut back on your living expenses. If you couldn't, then your last hope was to try and find some community or charity that would take you in, or rely on your children to take care of you in your old age. This is a common traditional custom we still see in many Asian cultures today. If you were way too big of an asshole and alienated your children, something a lot of boomers have done today, it was tough luck. There was no state or government welfare program to save you. You were on your own. So, if we're supposed to be grateful for these terrible economic conditions they created just because people in the past had it worse, should they give up their Social Security and be grateful just because the elderly in the past had it way, way worse? Yeah, somehow I doubt it. Per usual, they're a bunch of hypocrites who want to live under a different set of rules than everyone else. They want you to be grateful for these horrible economic conditions and not complain. But they themselves would never be grateful and not complain if they had to live like elderly people in the past. If they want to say we're not entitled to anything and nothing is free, would they give up their own Social Security? Not only is that not free, that's literally the biggest expense and burden on the national deficit by far. But at last, per usual, it's okay when they're the ones doing it. The worst thing about all this is that the way they justify and rationalize it is the biggest gigacope I've ever seen in my life. They'll tell you that you're paying into it for yourself and your own retirement in the future, but this is just objectively false. Due to how many boomers are draining from the Social Security Trust Fund right now, Social Security is projected to be cut significantly by 2035. And if it's already set to be cut in 2035, this means that even the oldest Gen Z won't be 40 yet by the time Social Security starts running out. And you still have another 25 years to go before you become of retirement age and get to see any of it. Looking at the current trajectory there is absolutely zero chance there will be anything left when Gen Z and millennials are old enough to retire. This is just classic boomer climbing the ladder and pulling it up behind you. No generation before them were entitled to Social Security benefits, and no generation after them will be either. They stand alone as the only generation in history to get to be this big of a burden and drain to the system, all while they shame you as being a burden for living with your parents or not working to pay their Social Security. It's no wonder why Gen Z doesn't want to work anymore. They're absolutely right to not want to work, get paid absolutely crap wages to begin with, and still having to pay Social Security taxes for retirement savings that they themselves will never see anyways. Hey guys, I just wanted to say real quick, thank you all so much for this insanely rapidly growing community we've built here. Feels like just a few days ago we were celebrating 10K, and now we're already over 11,000 subscribers. If you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing for more epic takedowns of delusional boomer logic. The solution. Okay, so here's where you're really going to want to listen up, especially if you're a young man. If you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that I'm a huge advocate for universal basic income. But rest assured, this video isn't going to be about UBI. I'm merely going to use the concept of UBI to give you guys some context about how bad you're getting screwed by the system right now. The main criticism I've gotten about UBI is we just can't afford it, and it's just going to make the price of everything go up. But the same thing applies to Social Security and every other welfare program as well. Social Security isn't made of some magic fairy dust money that magically doesn't have any effect on inflation. A lot of you have asked me how I would pay for the UBI, and the answer is really quite simple. A UBI giving every adult $1,000 per month would cost us a total of $2.8 trillion per year. This seems like a lot of money, and it is, until you realize that Social Security costing $1.4 trillion per year would already pay for half of what a UBI would cost. Now, if you simply add the cost of other means-tested welfare, means-tested, meaning the government tests you and determines if you should get it or not, this adds up to a total of $1.6 trillion. So if you were to simply eliminate the total cost of welfare benefits and Social Security, this already pays for the entire cost of UBI and then some. I've heard a lot of you out there expressing the concern that, well, what if the government decides to take away your UBI? What if they use it as a tool to control you? And here's what you guys are missing, especially if you're a young man. The government has already implemented a universal basic income for everyone besides you. The government has already given boomers, single moms, or whoever else you want to blame a UBI, but taken it away from you. You don't need to worry about the government taking it away from you because the government is already giving it to everyone else besides you under this current system we live in. So if they're going to give everyone besides you free money anyways, might as well fight for a universal basic income so that you at least get the same amount yourself. Rather than allowing the government to pick and choose who gets what, it makes a lot more sense and is a lot more fair if it's just universal and we all get the exact same amount. You could also just argue that every social benefit program under the sun should be cut, and I certainly understand this viewpoint. However, there are going to be people in society who we can all agree on deserve social support. For example, veterans who lost limbs in war. You're never going to be able to eliminate welfare completely, and so allowing the government to be able to pick and choose who gets it is a really slippery slope that, as we've all seen, leads to absolute disaster. So hopefully this answers your question of how would I pay for the UBI? It is not a perfect solution, but it's a hell of a lot better than our current welfare system by a long shot.
Our parents' generation, otherwise known as the baby boomers, are quite possibly the worst generation in the history of humanity. They're constantly shaming us to get a job and move out, and it's absolutely hilarious. They don't see the amazing hypocrisy in that. They're the ones who destroyed the economy and screwed up the housing market. They made it impossible to get a job and buy a house. Then they hardcore pressure and shame you for not working and not moving out. This would literally be like buying a plant, never giving it any water or sun, then yelling at it and shaming it for not growing. You should move out of your parents' house and stop playing video games. Well, here's the problem. My parents' house that you want me to move out of only cost them $50,000 to buy. Compared to salaries back then, they only had to work 4 years to be able to afford a whole friggin' house. Today, that same house costs 10 times as much, while salaries aren't that much higher, relatively speaking. In fact, I would have to work 20 years to be able to afford the same house that my parents only had to work 2 years for. But hey, maybe if I wasn't so lazy, I could learn how to magically bend time, work 240 hours a day, and close this 20-year gap, right? So, yeah, it's easy for you to say just move out and get your own place when it was literally 10 times easier for you to do so. The older generation thinks video games and technology have made us lazy. But the problem is, there's a massive hole in their logic that they don't even realize. The entire point of technology is to allow people to be lazy. Do you go to the grocery store to buy food? Well then, you're lazy. Past generations actually had to go out and hunt wild animals. Do you drive a car? Well then, you're lazy. Past generations had to walk everywhere. Have you ever taken an airplane? Well then, you're lazy. Past generations had to build an entire ship and sail for months to get to a foreign country. Did you build your own house that you live in? No? Well then, you're lazy, because the cavemen certainly had to do that. Our parents' generation thinks our generation is entitled. I don't think they even know what that word means, because if they did, they'd see that corporations and society are far more entitled than we'll ever be. Why do corporations feel like they're entitled to 40 hours a week of cheap youth labor in a world with skyrocketing inflation? If we don't make enough money, we're not entitled to buy nice things, right? So if companies don't make enough money to pay their workers a good wage, why are they entitled to get their best efforts? If I want to have a better life, I have to work hard and earn it, right? So if society wants me to stop playing video games and do something productive, then it too has to earn it. It's not entitled to my productivity. So if society isn't willing to fix the economy and build a bright future for its young people, why do they think they're entitled to contributions from us? I was playing a Pokemon game as a 12-year-old kid at church when the pastor told me that Pokemon was an unholy act of sin towards God and that I should stop. This was extremely confusing. How can these fuzzy, imaginary creatures be an unholy act of sin? I asked the pastor for his logic, and his response was legit, the most brain-dead, hilarious thing I've ever heard. He said that because Pokemon evolve, this promotes the theory of evolution and denies the existence of God. And that is when I stopped going to church.
You're so entitled. The world doesn't owe you anything. Why doesn't Gen Z want to work anymore?
The next time one of your boomer parents asks you this, tell them this. The world may not owe me anything, but I don't owe the world a damn thing either. I didn't ask to be born, and I don't owe it to the world or society to sacrifice my own life and happiness just to be another cheap labor machine for them. Maybe they're the ones who are actually entitled. They're the ones who think they're entitled to 40 hours of cheap labor every week in a world with unbearable, skyrocketing living expenses, and somehow have the audacity to ask why no one wants to work anymore. Entitlement is a two-way street, and it's time we start looking at it that way.
Society, especially the older generation, really hates gamers. They're always criticizing us, telling us to quit playing video games, to grow up and do something productive. There is so much delusion and lack of self-awareness in these types of statements that I just have to expose. The reason we spend so much time playing games is because they created such a miserable, awful society that we just have to escape from sometimes. And gaming is how we do it. They're the ones who screwed up the economy, made it impossible for young people to find jobs or buy homes, and destroyed our futures with their greed. And yeah, when you screw over the next generation like that and create such a miserable, depressing world to live in, of course, we'd rather just stay at home and play video games than quote-unquote grow up and work at a miserable job where we'll never make enough money to buy anything anyways. I have a solution in mind. If they want us to stop playing video games and do something productive, they need to go out and create a better society where it's actually worth it to do something productive.